Good day. Today is Sunday, 6th July 2025, and today, shortly after claims from the United States coming out of the United States that Iran had agreed to discussions with the United States which would take place over the course of the next couple of days, there have been categorical denials that this is the case from Iran. The Iranian authorities, again, are saying that they have no idea what the Americans are talking about, that given the strength of feeling in Iran about further talks with the United States at this time, setting up talks is going to be impossibly difficult. And the Iranians supposedly are also saying, well, not supposedly, the Iranians continue to say that before they do sit down and talk with the Americans, they still need the guarantees that the Americans have not yet provided that there will be no further attack upon Iran by the United States or presumably Israel whilst the talks are underway. Meanwhile, Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, has made a public appearance. This is a period of a major religious holiday within Shia Islam, commemorating, I believe, fallen martyrs in times past. I'm not somebody who is familiar with the calendar, the Shia calendar, but anyway, suffice to say that he did appear. He appeared in Tehran. Clearly, for the moment at least, he is not heeding or taking too seriously the threats from Israel, or perhaps there was a calculation in Iran that, especially at this particular time, it was essential that the supreme leader did make an appearance in order to strengthen morale inside the country. So, quickly, an observation which I think I have made before, but I wish to make again. The United States, at many times since the Trump administration took office, has given the impression that faster progress is being made in the various complex negotiations that it is engaged in than was actually the case. We saw that for many weeks in terms of the conflict in Ukraine. Throughout March and well into April, the United States was giving the impression that massive progress was being made, that a ceasefire was round the corner, that the negotiations were moving very quickly, that both Putin and Zelensky were signed up to American ideas to freeze the conflict or to end the conflict. And I was warning at the time that I didn't see any evidence of this at all, that as far as I could tell, the Russians were barely being spoken to, let alone making the kind of concessions to the Americans that many people thought they were or feared that they were, and that, in fact, this is a typical American negotiating tactic, very familiar to me from my previous careers, which was to overstate the degree to which negotiations were proceeding in order to put pressure on the other side, to get them to make concessions, to make them feel that if they didn't make the kind of concessions that the Americans wanted, then they would be presented to the world and to all of the other parties in the negotiations as the spoiler in the party in the negotiations that were taking place. And we see exactly the same pattern now with Iran. The United States needs negotiations with Iran. It is aware that the situation with Iran is very difficult. And for that reason, it's been going out telling everybody that progress is being made, that the Iranians have agreed to talk, that a meeting with the Iranians is round the corner, that some kind of a deal will be done soon after that meeting takes place, and the Iranians are coming back now and saying that this simply isn't true. I've said this previously with respect to the Russians. It bears repeating again in connection with the Iranians, that this tactic, which, as I said, is very, very common to people who deal with American businesses and American companies in commercial life, who are trying to negotiate with American law firms or businesses, as I said, in legal and commercial life, simply does not work in the world of international negotiations. The two are profoundly different, and thinking that talking up negotiations and making it appear that negotiations are moving faster than they actually are is a mistake, and that on the contrary, all it does ultimately is lead to disappointment and perhaps a worse outcome than might otherwise be the case. It cannot be said too strongly, but in dealing with parties certainly like Russia and China, but obviously like Iran also, there is simply no alternative to much more conventional negotiating tactics, setting up proper negotiating teams, working out the necessary negotiating positions and plans, meeting with the other side, engaging in the hard grind of negotiations, accepting that in the first weeks or months, sometimes even years, it seems as if no progress is being made at all, but gradually establishing contacts with the chief negotiators on the other side, getting a better sense of the views and perspectives of the other side, establishing more contacts with the people behind the scenes, getting a better sense of what the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, might be thinking, and the various other officials might be thinking, and then gradually discovering where the common ground might be and moving faster when that has been achieved towards a settlement. Now, I said that this could take months and years. Certainly with the Russians, it will do so if we're talking about a normalization of relations. If Donald Trump really does want to achieve a stable and secure rapprochement with the Russians, he needs to understand that this is a task that is going to take at the very least his entire term, and which will then have to be continued by his successor, whoever that might be. But with the Iranians, it ought to have been much easier. Iran has repeatedly said that it does not want to acquire a nuclear weapons capability. There are compelling reasons, or at least there were compelling reasons, before the attacks on Iran, which began on the 12th and 13th of June. There were compelling reasons why Iran might not want to obtain a nuclear weapons capability. The United States said that it did not want Iran to acquire a nuclear weapons capability, given that the ultimate end point was shared by both sides, and Iran without a nuclear weapons capability, it would not have taken years to find the way to a solution. It ought to have been something, if reason and sense had been followed, if maximalist demands had been put to one side, it would have been possible to find a way to come to a quicker agreement faster. Unfortunately, the effect of the 12-day war is that a process which ought to have been relatively straightforward, obviously not completely straightforward, is now going to be much, much more difficult because, as the Iranians themselves have said, there has now been a collapse of trust. So that's the thing to say about the negotiations there. Now, over the last couple of hours, more evidence has appeared of the extent of Iranian missile strikes on Israel during the 12-day war. And it's now clear that at least five important military sites in Israel, precisely the military sites which one would have expected would be the most heavily protected by Israel's air defense system, that at least five of those sites were struck by Iranian missiles. I remember during the 12-day war reading commentaries in the Iranian media which claimed that Iranian missiles were indeed hitting these targets and that this was being kept from the Israeli people and people in the West as a result of the tight censorship that was taking place within Israel itself. Well, satellite data has now apparently confirmed that those Iranian claims were true. This is one instance, one clear instance. I'm sure there have been many others, but that this has been one clear instance where the Iranian media was reporting what was happening in Israel during the 12-day war more accurately than the Israeli media were, than the Western media were, and than Western governments and the Israeli government were. Now, I'm not saying that this is the first time that has happened. I'm simply saying that this is one clear example when it did happen. We now have the proof of it. If you want an account of the damage done to Israeli military facilities within Israel itself, then I would suggest again going to Larry Johnson's Sonar 21 blog, where he discusses all of these things extensively, and with the eye, I should say, of a military, of an intelligence analyst. I've had a number of comments about Larry Johnson and the fact that I cite his blog. One or two people have pointed out that he's been wrong about some things. We are all at some point wrong about some things. I have been wrong about many things on these commentaries that I do on this program, as I have often had to point out. That doesn't mean that one shouldn't go to Larry Johnson's blog, because sometimes he makes mistakes. On this issue, I think we can say confidently that he is not making any mistakes. Just say. Anyway, there it is. So that is the reality. That gives us a sense of where we are. The Israelis did suffer significant damage. Their air defense system was exposed as far less effective than we had been led to believe before the war. The Israelis are saying that they've managed to shoot down 80% of the missiles that the Iranians launched against them. That may very well be true. But 20% of the missiles got through. And it could be also that some of the missiles that the Israelis did shoot down might have been older missiles intended to absorb Israeli air defense missiles. I've seen several commentators make that claim, and it makes complete sense to me. The point is that, by the Israelis' own admission, the Iranians have an enormous stockpile of missiles, 20,000 plus, according to some figures. I've received private figures from non-Iranian sources who put the Iranian missile stockpile much higher, just saying. But anyway, the point is that the Iranians were getting through and were inflicting significant damage, more damage than the Israelis cared to admit. So there it is. The United States, to repeat again, has lost track of what is happening with with Iran's nuclear enrichment program. I noticed that Seymour Hersh has now written a somewhat defiant piece on his blog, in which he, on the one hand, continues to insist that the information he got about the damage to Fordow from his sources within the US military was correct, but he is now, I also noticed, at least acknowledging the possibility that Iran might indeed have removed some of its enriched uranium from Fordow before the attack took place, so that Iran does have possibly, perhaps, as they themselves say, a stockpile of highly enriched uranium somewhere in Iran, which nobody knows where it is. Seymour Hersh continues to insist that with the destruction of Fordow and with the destruction of the facilities in Fordow, the centrifuges there, the Iranians have no possibility of enriching that uranium further, and that this has put back their program years. Well, that is, of course, an open question. It depends very much on where the centrifuges all were. He assumes that all of the centrifuges were in Fordow and Esfahan and Natanz, the three sites that were attacked. It's not impossible that the Iranians had more centrifuges in other locations, even if those sites were indeed destroyed in the way that he believes. And of course, he doesn't, of course, know, none of us does, how extensive the damage to Fordow actually was, and whether those centrifuges in Fordow really have been damaged beyond repair and are incapable of future operation. Now, on the last point, I should say that some days ago, I received a report, a very detailed and very thorough report on the American attack on Fordow. It gave me some very interesting insights into what had happened. Unfortunately, the nature of the sources was such that I simply cannot share any details or discuss even the origins of that report. So I'm afraid, even though I have some information, which I consider to be very reliable, I cannot share it. I judge that the information I'm getting, by the way, on the attack on Fordow is significantly more reliable than the information which is being provided to Seymour Hersh. Just saying. Anyway, there we are. That's where we are. So the Americans have no idea what Iran is doing with any highly enriched uranium that it has. It doesn't know where that highly enriched uranium might be. It doesn't know whether the Iranians have available centrifuges to enrich it later. And of course, the IAEA is still not being allowed back into Iran. And I get the sense that, as far as the Iranians are concerned, that is a final decision. I don't think they're going to reverse it anytime soon. The Iranians say that they have lost all trust in the United States, that it is for the Americans to give guarantees that there won't be future attacks on Iran in a form that would restore that trust. I am not sure what guarantees the Americans can provide that would do that. And I have to say, for the moment, my own sense is that we are at a total impasse, and I cannot myself see how the negotiation between the United States and Iran for the moment can proceed. Now, a couple of weeks ago, before the attack on Iran took place, there was talk that the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, was planning a trip to Iran, that he would be meeting there with Pezeshkian and with other senior Iranian officials, that he would probably be meeting with the supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei himself. Most of this was intended to be about economic matters, though no doubt military issues were going to be discussed as well. Probably the delivery of the Sukhoi 35 fighter jets, which has been, as I discussed in a recent program, a tangled story, with the Iranians first saying that they were intending to buy Sukhoi 35 fighter jets in December 2022, then walking back that in August 2023, then talking again later in 2023 how they were still intending to buy the Sukhoi 35s, and that they were then saying that this would be finalized in 2024, and then reversing themselves again, and then only saying once again that they would buy the Sukhoi 35s in January 2025. Anyway, this has been a long, complex story going back many years, and it has been Iran, as I discussed in previous programs, which are various reasons, many of which, by the way, I completely understand and even have a measure of sympathy for, given the complex relationship in the past between Russia and Iran. But contrary to much of the commentary that one reads, it's clear to me that it was Iran that has been dragging its heels on this question, not Russia. In fact, the Russians were proposing to sell Iran or supply Iran with a batch of Sukhoi 35s that they had been intending to sell to Egypt. Egypt pulled out of that agreement under American pressure. That left the Sukhoi 35s available to transfer to Iran. The Iranians, as I said, dithered and said yes and no and yes and no. And eventually the Russians decided that they would deliver these Sukhoi 35s to a different customer, which was Algeria. And it would probably take a while now before additional Sukhoi 35s could be manufactured to make up that batch, which the Iranians could have had, but hesitated for various reasons, good and bad, to buy. Now, a lot of people have been recently talking about the JC-10 that the Chinese have been producing since the 1980s. I've actually done some research about this question as well. I discovered that, in fact, Iran expressed its first interest in buying the JC-10 way back in 2015, before the before the Sukhoi 35 purchase was first discussed. And again, the same thing happened. The Iranians spoke about an interest to buy the JC-10 then. The Chinese seemed willing to do this. Then there were arguments about payments. Then the Iranians appeared to cool on the idea. Then eventually, quietly, the whole idea was abandoned until apparently this year, when an Iranian official, the Iranian defense minister no less, finally showed some interest in buying the JC-10. And I understand again that JC-10 aircraft, which might have been available for transfer to Iran, some of them apparently ended up in Pakistan instead. Again, one shouldn't be too critical. Iran is an sovereign, independent country. It values its sovereignty and its independence very highly. It is developing its own military industrial complex, which it regards as essential for its long-term security and its independence. It has always shown hesitation in buying weapons in large quantities and becoming dependent on the goodwill of third parties. China, in the case of the JC-10, Russia, in the case of the Sukhoi 35. But the fact is, people who tend to criticize the Chinese or the Russians in this regard are making, in my opinion, misplaced criticisms. Anyway, returning to Putin's intended visit to Iran, perhaps, possibly, this issue of the Sukhoi 35s would have been finally resolved then. Maybe we would have had some movement also on developing an integrated air defense system where the Russians were prepared to provide assistance. There is no word whether, after the 12-day war, given the very dangerous situation now in visiting Iran, or at least the apparently dangerous situation in visiting Iran, whether that trip by Putin is indeed going to happen. Probably at some point it will. There are economic and trade issues to resolve as well. The establishment of the North-South corridor between Russia and Iran, the development of trade links and economic contacts, the further integration of the financial systems of the two countries. I understand that the Mir card can now be accessed, the Russian Mir card can be accessed through Iranian banks, for example. But anyway, there's no word when and if this trip by Putin is going to happen. But my guess is, my suggestion is that perhaps if we're looking for a diplomatic breakthrough between the United States and Iran, it is unlikely to happen unless Iran receives military guarantees. I can't see the United States providing those guarantees. Russia and perhaps China possibly can. And that may mean that we're not going to see any movement in terms of diplomacy between Iran and the United States unless and until that trip by Putin finally takes place. Just saying. So, that's where we are, it seems to me, in the diplomacy between the United States and Iran. Of course, the longer this situation continues, without the IAEA present in Iran, with no inspections of Iranian nuclear facilities, with the Iranians perhaps reconstituting their nuclear enrichment program. After all, that's what they say they're going to do. The longer this continues, the more Israel takes steps to re-equip and rearm, the greater the danger of a resumption of the conflict, the direct conflict between Iran and Israel. In fact, I would suggest that it is only a question of time. So anyway, that, it seems to me, is the situation. I was puzzled by the American reports that negotiations, talks between the Iranians and the Americans were going to restart. I said that it would contradict what the Iranians have been saying, but I also said that given the divisions within Iran, if such talks did take place, it would not completely surprise me. Well, we now have clarity. The talks are not going to take place, and we are and continue to be in an impasse. Before I leave the topic of Iran, I just want to say something further about the JC-10, and it's a somewhat mischievous point, which is that I hadn't known very much about the JC-10 until the last couple of days, but then I started to read about it, and I discovered with interest that there is apparently a whole cottage industry of speculation, including speculation based on some claims by engineers in Russia that the JC-10, the Chinese JC-10 fighter jet, is in fact nothing else, nothing more or less than a straight derivative of the Israeli Lavi fighter project of the 1980s. Now, I remember the Lavi. This was a fighter jet that Israel was intending to produce. It was supposed to be the successor to the Kfir, which is an earlier Israeli fighter jet, which was basically an adaptation of the Mirage 3. But the Lavi was going to be a much more advanced fourth generation fighter jet, a complete clean sheet design, very sophisticated, and Israeli industries were principally involved in its development, though the Israelis did need some degree of financial and technical support from the United States to bring it to completion. And then what eventually happened was that the US decided that if the Israelis were to succeed in developing the Lavi would compete against the F-16 on world fighter jet markets, and they pulled the plug on the entire project. Now, as I think I discussed in an earlier program, it's not widely known that in discussing these three countries, Russia, China, and Iran, all three of them have at various times had close relations with Israel. So Russia, of course, has maintained good relations with Israel through much of the Putin era. At one time, Putin was visiting Israel and I seem to remember, visiting the wall of the temple wall in Jerusalem. And he seemed to have a very friendly relationship with Prime Minister Netanyahu, who he once invited and who attended a Victory Day parade in Moscow on the 9th of May. So the Russians do have those strong connections with Israel, and as Putin has correctly pointed out, there is now a large Russian Jewish community in Israel, predominantly apparently located in and around Tel Aviv, where Russian is often heard. So that is a public relationship, and as far as I know, however, the Russians have never sold military technology or bought military technology from Israel in any great quantity, though after the 2008 war with Georgia, when they discovered that they were short of advanced drones, they did buy Israeli drones from Israel, which they then adapted into the four-post drones, which the Russian Air Force still uses, including in the conflict in Ukraine. So anyway, that was the Russian relationship. Iran also has had an intense relationship with Israel. Of course, it was particularly strong during the time of the former Shah, but after the Islamic Revolution, despite the complete apparent breakdown of relations between Israel and Iran, in fact, Israel and Iran developed a fairly close military and political relationship at a time when Iran was involved in its war against Iraq, Saddam Hussein's Iraq, in the 1980s. And during that period, Iran was importing weapons from Israel to wage that war, principally spare parts to the various British and American weapons which Iran was equipped with as a result of the massive arms purchases carried out by the former Shah. And China also imported weapons technologies from Israel during the 1970s and early 1980s. And when the JC-10 appeared, and it appeared to bear a certain resemblance to the Lavi, of course, a lot of people said that in fact what happened was that China bought the plans of the Lavi from Israel. Now, I am not an aerospace engineer. I've read a little about the JC-10 program that the Chinese have released. That makes it look to me very unlikely that the JC-10 does indeed derive from or is based upon the Lavi. But then I'm not going to say definitely that it isn't. The Chinese, I should say, categorically deny that it is. If Iran does ever buy the JC-10, then there would be an irony in all of this if it is indeed based on the Lavi, or perhaps draws some design cues from the Lavi, because in that case, of course, Israeli aerospace technology would end up being used by Iran against Israel. Anyway, I just throw in that piece of history for what it's worth. I think more likely the aircraft that Iran is in the end going to buy is going to be the Sukhoi 35. It would need Putin and Pezeshkian, presumably, to sign a formal agreement to do it. Maybe it will happen. We shall see. But it probably won't happen unless and until Putin visits Iran and all of these blockages and log jams in the relationship are finally resolved. Lastly, there was a very interesting article recently in the Financial Times which discussed the attitude to this conflict of Saudi Arabia and of the various Gulf states. Now, there's been a steady drumbeat of articles appearing over the last few weeks in various Western newspapers that, in fact, the Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia, far from being happy about the Israeli and American attacks on Iran, are furious about them, are alarmed about the way in which Israel conducted the attack on Iran without informing them in advance, have come to see Israel as the major rogue actor and source of instability in the Middle East, and have chosen to stick by their rapprochement with Iran. Now, there's been strenuous denials of this in some places. I've read articles, for example, by people like Colonel Richard Kemp in the Daily Telegraph, who strongly disputes that this is so. According to him, the relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia remains as unfriendly as always. The appearance of rapprochement between the two is simply a cover, that there is no real truth to it. And in fact, the Saudis quietly were delighted by the attack by Israel upon Iran and about the damage that Iran supposedly suffered. I have to say, I believe the actual reports, like the one in the Financial Times, which say that, on the contrary, the Saudis and the Gulf states were indeed alarmed by the Israeli attack on Iran and have made absolutely clear, both to the Israelis and to the Americans, that they're not happy and that they're going to continue with their relationship with Iran. The one clear thing I would have thought, as far as the Arab oil producers, is that they will not want a spread of instability in their region. they're very conscious of the dangers of that and of the dangers of instability that were developing during their own conflict with Iran. And of course, they will not want the closure of the Gulf of Hormuz, which would be an economic disaster for all of them. So, given that apparently the Iranians did come very close to closing the Gulf of Hormuz during the 12-day war, I think that that is something that the Gulf states and the Saudis will most definitely want to avoid. And for that reason, if no other, they will oppose further Israeli and American attacks on Iran and will have made clear to the Iranians that they're not their adversaries, that they do want to maintain a stable relationship with them, and that they value and seek to preserve their rapprochement. Now, some of these countries are going to be meeting in Rio, in Brazil, over the next couple of days in connection with the ongoing BRICS summit meeting. Apparently, Pezeshkian is traveling to Brazil, where he will be meeting with Lula and the others. Prime Minister Modi of India will be there. He has recently given an interview in which he has emphasized India's very strong commitment to the BRICS. There's been some claims that India was distancing itself from the BRICS, but Modi has gone out of his way to deny that this is the case. But there's been a lot of commentary and speculation about the absence from Brazil of the two arguably most powerful BRICS leaders. Neither Putin nor Xi Jinping are going. Now, in the case of Putin, I don't think it's complicated. In order for Putin to reach Brazil, he would his aircraft would have to overfly airspace where it would be vulnerable to potential interception by Western air forces. And I have discussed previously in earlier programs why, especially with the outstanding warrant against him from the ICC, but with the extraordinary, unstable situation generally, and the extraordinary campaign against Putin personally that one sees in the Western media, I think for Putin to travel these long distances across the Atlantic to Brazil would be to take an unacceptable risk. Medvedev, the deputy chair of Russia's Security Council and the former president and prime minister of Russia, has recently given an interview in which he has spoken of the key role, the essential role that Putin continues to play in Russian decision-making. He says that the hierarchy of decision-making in Russia is clear. There is only one ultimate decision-maker, and that is the President Putin himself. Now, Medvedev, strictly speaking, is talking the absolute truth. The Security Council of Russia, enormously powerful body, as it has clearly now become, meeting every week in the same rooms that used to be occupied by the former Soviet Politburo, with all of the top people in the Russian political and decision-making process clearly members. The Security Council, nonetheless, legally speaking, remains a purely advisory body. Putin not only picks the members, but is not obliged to follow its recommendations. If he decides on a course which all of the other members of the Security Council oppose, he can in theory insist on that course being followed. In practice, I don't believe that has ever happened. Putin has always impressed me as the sort of leader who is very, very careful to ensure, whenever he makes a decision, that he has the full support of all of the key decision makers in Russia brought together in the Security Council. But Medvedev's comments clearly are intended again to highlight Putin's key importance at this particular time in the decision-making process in Russia. This is not a good moment to start taking risks on Putin's behalf by expecting him to fly all the way to Brazil to attend a summit meeting, a BRICS summit meeting, when, as I said, he could potentially be at risk. Even when Putin visited the Gulf states, as I remember that he did, at the end of 2023, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, I noticed that his aircraft had a fighter jet escort provided by the Russian Air Force. Of course, that would be impossible on a trip to faraway Brazil, and I think it makes absolute sense that he is not going. Russia will be represented by its Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov instead. In the case of Xi Jinping, there is much more discussion about the reasons for Xi Jinping's absence, and it's inevitably resulted in a spate of commentary and speculation in the media, in the Western media, that Xi Jinping is facing some kind of political challenge in Beijing and that his position in China is being challenged. I don't see the slightest evidence for that at all. None. He continues, it seems to me, to dominate Chinese politics. I don't see any sign that his authority within China is slipping. As Professor Kerry Brown, who is an expert on Chinese politics and who we interviewed a few weeks ago on the Duran, correctly pointed out, the clearest sign of Xi Jinping's authority is the Chinese media, which continues to quote him extensively and in which there isn't the slightest indicator or sign that his position is in any way threatened. I suspect that Xi Jinping is not going to Brazil for one very simple reason, and that is that he knows that Putin is not going. And he doesn't want to go to Brazil without Putin, because Putin ultimately is his essential partner. Putin and Xi will nonetheless participate in the Rio summit, the BRICS summit meeting, and they will do so virtually. Both men will provide addresses, they will speak to the various leaders, they will provide speeches to the plenary sessions, and both of their countries will be strongly represented, in the case of Russia by Lavrov, in the case of China by the Chinese Prime Minister Li Qian. So I don't think one should read too much into this. The BRICS summit meeting in Brazil, it seems to me, is a sequel to the BRICS summit meeting which took place in Kazan back in October. Most of the key decisions were made in Kazan about setting up the various payment systems. The Brazilians have apparently worked very hard to take all of that forward and have apparently done so successfully. And Lula continues to speak out in support of these payment systems and has made some very strong criticisms of the IMF, for example, recently, which he has described as an outdated organization. He is right about that. I noticed, for example, that the IMF continues to authorize large loan payments to Ukraine, notwithstanding that by any objective measure now, Ukraine cannot possibly fulfill IMF borrowing criteria. But anyway, put that aside. These technical matters will undoubtedly be moved forward in Brazil. The big political decisions have already been taken. They do not require the presence of Xi Jinping and of Putin. That doesn't mean that the BRICS are losing momentum or anything like that. I suspect we will get further decisions out of Rio, and they will be on the movement forward of all of those payment systems that I have previously been talking about. Some speculation in some parts of the media that the reserve currency status of the dollar is not being challenged, or that the challenge to it has somehow evaporated, is certainly wrong. It's bizarre, by the way, how commentary in the West flips about this. Just a few weeks ago, because of the tariff question, people were talking about the fact that the dollar was losing its allure, and people were pointing to the surge in gold as proof of this. Now, because Putin and Xi are not attending the BRICS summit meeting, people are now arguing the opposite. To repeat again, whatever earlier plans there might have been to set up a BRICS alternative currency to the dollar were quickly abandoned some years ago when the challenges of doing this became clear. What is going to happen instead, or what is being worked on instead, is not the creation of alternative currency systems, but the creation of alternative payment systems using blockchain technology and digital currencies and those sort of things. Apparently, much of the theoretical work has been done in Russian universities. I suspect much of the technical work has been done in China. The Brazilians have probably been working hard to bring that all together, and we will learn more about it probably over the next couple of days. Anyway, that's what I think is going to happen. Importantly, it appears that India remains fully on board. So that's my own assessment of all of this. Now, talking about BRICS currencies, talking about tariff questions, and all of that now brings me back to the Ukraine crisis and to President Trump. Now, President Trump, after saying how disappointed he had been with Putin, appeared to praise Putin again, but he did so in terms that might be considered ambiguous. Now, again, this was not said in any of Trump's Truth Social posts. Trump has spoken to Putin, Zelensky, and Merz, but there have been no American readouts of these conversations, and Trump himself has not provided commentaries about these conversations on his Truth Social account as he usually does. Instead, if you go to his Truth Social account, it is full of perhaps not entirely, in fact fully justified pleasure about the passing of his big beautiful bill. He's not talking about these conversations with these leaders, Putin, Merz, and Zelensky. But he is speaking to reporters, and he's reported to have said these words: "We talk about sanctions a lot. He, that is to say Putin, has been able to manage sanctions, but these are pretty binding sanctions. And he then spoke about the possibility of new sanctions in connection with the conflict in Ukraine. He said, now we talk about sanctions a lot. Putin understands that they might be coming. He is a professional. It may be coming. And Putin is not thrilled about the possibility. But Trump went on to say, I think I'm tougher in Russia than I am on Iran. Now, some people are interpreting these words as suggesting that Trump is indeed thinking about imposing more sanctions against Russia. He has been saying all kinds of different things to various people. Many people took the meaning of his conversations with Zelensky and Merz to suggest that he is going to provide Patriot missile interceptors to Ukraine after all. But as I pointed out in my program yesterday, in reality and in fact, it's clear that he made no such commitment. He just floated the possibility at some future time. So it's not always easy to decipher exactly what Trump means. Now, he does have the problem, if that's the correct word, of Lindsey Graham and Blumenthal's bone-crunching sanctions bill, which is still there in the Senate. Both Lindsey Graham and Blumenthal apparently recognize that sanctions bill can only move forward if Trump supports it. Trump has not so far given any indication that he does. On the contrary, commentary from people like Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, suggests that Trump does not. And we've had the contrary reports in Politico that Steve Witkoff is suggesting that instead of going down the route proposed by Lindsey Graham and Blumenthal, the better thing in the interests of the United States is to hold back from sanctions and, in fact, to ease the sanctions on Russia, to rescind all of the sanctions on Russian oil, on Russian energy exports, because doing otherwise would risk increasing the price of oil, and that the best way to reduce the price of oil, which is now becoming extremely important for President Trump's long-term political position and for his plans to revive the United States, reducing the price of oil is best done by lifting the energy sanctions on Russia. Now, I think that Trump's words and his silence on Truth Social again suggest that he's not made a final decision. But I suspect in this case that he's gradually edging away from the idea of imposing these sanctions. Certainly the word up to now has pointed that way. And interestingly, according to the commentary provided by Putin's aide, Yuri Ushakov, about Trump's latest conversation with Putin, they apparently discussed energy issues with each other, which suggests that for Trump, keeping the price of oil low remains a priority, and that he is not therefore inclined to go down the route that Lindsey Graham and Blumenthal are suggesting. I should say that in connection with the BRICS summit, there's been a number of statements from Indian officials now, and they continue to speak about the importance for India of the economic relationship with Russia, and I get no sense that India is rethinking its previous policy of buying oil from Russia, cheap oil from Russia. Now, it could be, it might be, that the United States could impose bone-crunching sanctions against Russia and exempt India from them. And it might conceivably do the same with China, with which, of course, the United States has just signed a trade deal. China, as I've discussed in recent programs, has now made it absolutely clear that it backs Russia in the conflict in Ukraine, and that it is therefore not going to let itself be intimidated from buying Russian oil. So it might be the case that the United States will take this make this very unsatisfactory decision, impose these sanctions, but then exempt, say, Turkey, which also buys oil and even more so gas from Russia, India and China from sanctions. What in that case would be the point of it? Why go down that route at all? It seems to me that, as I said, there is probably a discussion underway. I think that Trump has not made a final decision, but the fact that he's talking about Putin being a professional suggests to me that he realizes that the Russians will always find a way to circumvent sanctions, and that he is very, very reluctant to do something that would either be ineffective and expose the United States as doing something ineffective, and which would also antagonize Putin and perhaps put at risk the economic future of the United States and Donald Trump's own political position. I ought to say, and there's been some comments about this, that in a curious way, China and the United States are diverging on economic policy. China, and I suspect before long Russia as well, based on the various decisions that I noticed the Russians have been taking. China and perhaps Russia, but certainly China, are moving away from fossil fuels. They're investing very heavily in alternative energy technologies. And in both cases, and this is underestimated by much of the media commentary in the West, they are investing very heavily in other forms of energy generation, hydropower, dams and such things, and above all nuclear power, in which both Russia and China are now starting to become the world leaders. And of course, both are investing heavily in battery technology. There is no comparison here between Russian industry and Chinese industry. The Chinese have the world's biggest industry in battery technology, but then the Russians have just captured the big lithium deposit near the village of Shevchenko in Ukraine, the biggest lithium deposit in Europe, apparently, and they got lithium deposits on their own, and they're moving forward with developing rare earths and all of that. So maybe in 10 years' time, they might be similar position to the one that China is in today here. But anyway, they seem to be moving in that direction. Whereas under Donald Trump, the United States is recommitting to fossil fuels. Now, there's been much discussion about which is the correct course, and I'm not going to discuss that in this program. But if you are recommitting to fossil fuels, which is what the United States appears to be doing, and if you are now starting to see a decline in fossil fuel output in the United States, which with the maturing of the shale revolution you are starting to see, then of course you cannot afford high energy oil and gas prices on the global energy markets in the indefinite future. And I cannot imagine that Donald Trump isn't at some level aware of that. So anyway, to return to what we're saying, I don't think the United States is likely to go down that route. Having said that, Trump, the route of further sanctions against Russia. Having said that, Trump is never anything but unpredictable, and one can never say, one can never be completely sure. But anyway, returning now to other matters. The Russians again, not last night, but early this morning, renewed their drone offensive, their drone and missile offensive against Ukraine. As I said, the previous big attack on Kiev involved a strike on Kiev with more than 500 Geran 2 drones over the course of a single night, and all of the indications are that drone production is continuing. Geran 2 drone production is continuing to grow. Russian drone production and missile production is increasing anyway. And on these topics, I've noticed that certain sections of the media in the United States and in Europe are now picking up on the NBC story that the decision to stop Patriot missile deliveries to Ukraine was a political decision, that it has nothing to do with depleted stockpiles. These reports are unquestionably false, just to say, and it's bizarre, and it tells us a great deal actually about the politicization of this whole topic, that people in the media in the West are refusing to acknowledge that. And of course it does put the administration at an enormous disadvantage, because the United States, even though it is facing the problem of depleted stockpiles, is going to be very, very reluctant to come out and straightforwardly admit to the full truth of this. Because, of course, doing that, disclosing how depleted the stockpiles now are, is going to disclose that very same fact, that all of that information to America's adversaries, not just China, but specifically now and at this time to Iran. I spoke earlier in this program about how we now know that Iran was able to hit 5 military sites in Israel. We now know also about how the Israelis were running short of air defense missiles intended to shoot down ballistic missiles. Israel had to turn to the United States for help to shoot down incoming Iranian ballistic missiles. The United States is desperate to start renegotiations with Iran again. It cannot afford at this time to disclose to Iran specifically how weak its hand has become, because if the war resumes between Iran and Israel, it is not going to be in a position to defend Israel from incoming Iranian ballistic missiles. So the administration is in a very difficult position in countering these stories about depletion of its stockpiles. But to repeat again, there is no doubt that they are true. A member of the Duran community, somebody who watches these programs, actually pointed out on a thread to my previous video that some time ago, in Biden's time, no less a person than Jake Sullivan acknowledged that even within the overall total of Patriot ballistic missile interceptors that the United States produces. The kind of Patriot missile interceptors that are specifically to shoot down ballistic missiles makes up only a small fraction. I seem to recall that it was around 30 a month. The United States perhaps has increased production of these missile interceptors to a certain degree, but that article in The Economist, which I discussed yesterday, puts a big question mark against that. Given the scale of the Russian drone and missile offensive taking place against Ukraine, if the United States were to resume deliveries of these types of missiles, Patriot missiles, to Iran now, it would run out of these missiles entirely in no time. Just to say. So that is the reality. As Brian Beletic and others have been pointing out for some time, events over the last 3.5 years have led to this point, and we have now reached it. So, to repeat again, when Trump talks about how tough the situation is, how Putin is a very professional, you can see that deep down he is finally acknowledging to himself something which on the Iran we have been pointing out for a very, very long time, that he has no real leverage over the Russians. The Russians are in the driving seat when it comes to Ukraine, and the situation is not one that he can reshape and influence in the way that he perhaps thought, and the project of freezing the conflict on the existing front lines is beyond his reach. Now, I am not going to provide a detailed military update of the situation in Ukraine in this program. I would say that somewhat to my astonishment, I've seen again some claims circulate that the Russian offensive over the last couple of days has slowed down. I'm completely unable to see the evidence for that myself, just saying. It seems to me that the lava flow, to use the expression that is now becoming popular, and which originates in the Pentagon, but which we were the first apparently on the Duran to publicize, the lava flow, which is the Russian advance, continues to surge eastwards. And perhaps the most dramatic news, though it has not so far been fully confirmed, is that apparently Russian troops from the east, advancing from the east, have now broken into Siversk itself. There's apparently been fighting in Siversk, and there's also been news over the last couple of hours, and this comes from the Russian Defense Ministry, that 2 villages immediately to the west of Kupiansk, Moskovka and Sobolevka, have just been captured by the Russian army. That information, it seems to me, is probably reliable because it comes from the Russian Defense Ministry itself. Some days ago, I read a report on Redovka that spoke of intense street fighting taking place in Kupiansk, and of Kupiansk effectively being stormed, and of the Russians gradually cutting off the Ukrainian defenders inside Kupiansk. And this information from the Russian Defense Ministry seems to corroborate that. I'm not the best person to read maps, and I'm not absolutely certain of all of the things I've just been saying about Kupiansk. But to the best of my ability from the maps that I am seeing, it does seem as if these two villages, Moskovskaya and Sobolevka, are indeed on the western flank of Kupiansk. And it does seem as if this town, which has been fought over, is now indeed essentially cut off. The supplies to it are essentially cut off, and that the fighting that is taking place within that town probably represents the last stage of the battle there. The same undoubtedly is true of Chasiv Yar. I suspect that we will probably get an announcement from the Defense Ministry about the fall of Chasiv Yar at some point within the next couple of days. And there's apparently been more reports of advances northeast of Pakrovsk, where the Ukrainians are getting more and more alarmed by the situation. Though in some ways the most consequential and biggest advances are happening in the western Donbass area as the Russians continue to advance westwards towards the Dnieper and towards eventually the city of Zaporozhye itself. Anyway, to repeat again, I see absolutely no sign of any slowdown in the Russian advance. I suspect what may be confusing some people is that now is a time when quite a few of the Telegram channels that publicize information, a lot of the people are taking their annual holidays. I've already noticed a reduction in reporting from some of them as a result of this. And I suspect also there's been, as it often is, immediately prior to big events, a clampdown in information, both from the Russians to conceal the extent of their advances and from the Ukrainians to conceal the extent of their losses. I suspect that in 1 week's time, when all the information about the situation starts to pour in, we will be seeing quite a lot of news, further news, develop. Now, I ought to quickly say, the Siversk news, I'm not absolutely certain about. It could just be a reconnaissance group entering eastern Siversk rather than a serious attempt to storm the town. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about that today. I'll be returning to all of these topics in my next programs. Remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribe Star, links under this video. Don't forget also that you can go to our shop, buy all the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, the ones with the labels of the cities, links under this video. And if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.